Director of Planning for the City of Spring Hill. And we have our Assistant City Administrator, Dan Allen, in the front as well. What we'll be doing today is having a brief discussion addressing what is the urban growth boundary. What are the criteria that identifies what is the urban growth boundary? Why are we having this conversation, and where is the urban growth boundary located? To begin with, an urban growth boundary is essentially the expansion of the city's area to what we determine what areas that we may add additional land. What are the criteria for this? First, we have to identify, do we have adequate facilities? And that includes things as of sewer, water lines, utilities, infrastructure. We're looking at those type of things. We look at, can we obtain the necessary infrastructure to support that additional growth area? You know, what things do we need to take in consideration that would allow us to have the funding revenue to develop those particular areas? And ultimately, how would the city manage the urban growth boundary development? One way we look at managing the urban growth boundary development area is through what something is identified as a comprehensive plan. The city has the 2040 Rising Spring Hill plan, and that's what's used to essentially manage or identify the particular type of uses that can come into that urban growth boundary area. A little bit about the process. If the city identifies it wants to expand our urban growth boundary, once that area is identified, the next step after that area is identified is those properties within the urban growth boundary areas, they won't be part of the city at that moment. The next step, the property owner would have to annex into the city before those properties would be identified as part of the cities. And that's a process that would have to go through an annexation, then a rezoning site plan. So it's a process that occurs that goes through our appointed and elected officials, with ultimately our Board of Mayor and Aldermen determining what properties can be annexed and or rezoned. So that's the first thing. So why are we having this conversation? The reason we're having this conversation is because we want to gather input from our stakeholders, our residents, our taxpayers, and our property owners. Right now, on the City of Spring Hill website, we have a survey that we would like for anyone who sees it to fill it out. It's a very short survey. It's 8 questions. We're looking at gathering that information to assist us with identifying what are the needs, what are the things that those who don't work in the city, unless you're a resident as well, what are the things that you want to see? What are some of the priorities? What are the things that's most important to you? Also, what we're looking to also identify is the open space areas that we can have, parks, amenities, sidewalks, roadways, infrastructure, as well as development. What is spurring the city of Spring Hill to consider expanding our urban growth boundary? And it's essentially population growth. As many people know, over the last decade, the population of Spring Hill has grown astronomically. Over the past 10 years, myself, our associate planner, Jake McQueen, we have looked at the past 10 years of population growth within the city of Spring Hill. That population growth is approximately 7.2% growth per year. As of today, the city of Spring Hill has about 50,000 5 people population. When you project that 7.2% growth, if we continue to grow at that number over the next 10 years, the city could have in excess of 100,000 people. Now, when you hear that number, you say that's a big number. That's totally unrealistic. I wouldn't argue as if that isn't a big number. And the reason being because the last year, 2020, the city had about 26% growth increase in that 1 year, which could skew the numbers. So if we decided not to go with the last year of growth and only look at the years before, that growth is approximately 4.8, 4.6% of growth per year. Even if we use that number over the next 10 years, the projected growth population or population growth would be over 85,000 people within Spring Hill. So what does that mean to us? We have to identify how we can continue to grow our economy, our economic base in a responsible manner that would allow the city to continue to grow, move forward, and be self-sustaining. So how do we do that? There's multiple ways. In the past, not necessarily Spring Hill, but in the past and just cities growing in general, cities grew from using their tax base. And the city would shoulder the burden of growing the infrastructure development, etc. However, that's not anything I believe that the citizens want or even developers or the city. So the next option is to, which may not be realistic as well, is to expect the developers to provide all of the infrastructure, funding, and improvements. That may not be realistic as well because in order for development to occur from the private sector, there has to be a way that they can financially afford that, grow not only their businesses, but be able to be self-sustaining as well. So that leaves us with a third option. And that third option is more of a joint agreement between the developer and the city working together. And what would that joint agreement look like? It would look like the developer identifying particular lands that they are interested in. They would want to develop that land. They would provide the necessary infrastructure in order to responsibly grow that land or to develop that land, while the city, on the other hand, looking to maintain and manage that land, will provide the necessary infrastructures to tie into that development. So, with that being said, how is the urban growth boundary related to this? We have identified 2 sections of the city in Williamson County. As of this moment, there are about 7 municipalities that are working together within Williamson County, looking to each expand their urban growth boundary. And you have Nolensville, Fairview, Brent, Franklin, City of Spring Hill, Williamson County, all working together, having conversations to identify what are the areas that we're looking at. And in those areas, the City of Spring Hill has identified 2 areas. One area in Williamson County, as we have on a map, in the northeasternmost section of Spring Hill, there's about 4 square miles. And these 4 square miles is what the City of Spring Hill is looking at as a potential area that the city can expand its urban growth boundary into that area. Now remember, if the City of Spring Hill expands the urban growth boundary into that area, that does not automatically make those properties within that urban growth boundary a part of the City of Spring Hill. Those properties within that urban growth boundary would still need to go to the city to file an application to have that land annexed into the city. So as part of that land being annexed, The city would then do our due diligence, identifying the necessary infrastructure improvements that's required for that land, and we'll do that through a plans of service, which calls out the utilities, roadways, and other connectivities that's required for that. And also taking, just going back a little bit to understand, we would also use our 2040 Rising Spring Hill plan to identify if the uses that the potential or the landowner would like to annex and rezone to that property to is an allowed use. Now, currently our 2040 Rising plan is approximately 6 years old. Our Board of Mayor and Aldermen has voted to approve additional funding to the planning department so that we can update or do an overhaul of our 2040 Spring Hill Rising Plan. So it would possibly be known as the 2050 Spring Hill Rising Plan or some other name. And what's important now is, as we're doing this urban growth boundary conversation and other conversations in the future, that we're going to actively engage the public and gather your input to identify what's important to you. How would that expansion or that improvement of our long-range plan, how would it look? What are we trying to maintain in our urban growth boundary areas and other areas? How do we maintain certain areas have more of a more rural characteristic? Some may have more of an agricultural, some residential. However, we have to also identify another economic base, which is businesses, to provide that additional revenue that the city will need in order to move forward. The second area that we're looking at is on the northwestern portion of Spring Hill, going to Williamson County. It's about 3 square miles. And this area, it has the Duck River. So you see these blue lines, they're identifying contours and also the Duck Rivers in that area. This is another area, just like we saw on the northeastern side, that's going to need significant infrastructure improvement in order to get development to that area. However, as I identified, without the updating of our Spring Hill Rising 2040 plan, it would help us to identify how those areas would look, what type of development would be brought into that area. So with that being said, just to do a quick recap, the city of Spring Hill is looking to do a total of expanding our urban growth boundary within Williamson County on the northeastern and northwesternmost borders for a total of 7 square miles. The process that would be required is 1, any properties that fall within that urban growth boundary the property owner would need to submit applications to the city of Spring Hill to annex the land from the county into the city of Spring Hill. During that annexation, a plans of service which identifies the necessary infrastructure, capacity, what would need to occur in order to make that land a developable land and can be responsibly managed in the future would have to occur. Then after the annexation, a rezoning would have to occur on that land. When land is annexed into the city, it automatically takes on an agricultural land use. That is the least intense zoning designation that the city has. They would have to rezone to the identification that's known within our comp plan or the 2040-2050 Rising Plan. In order to rezone, that applicant would have to identify how are they meeting the 2040-2050 Rising Plan. And after they do that, it goes before the Planning Commission to receive a vote. And then the next step, it goes before the Board of Mayor and Aldermen to receive the final vote and authorization. So in a nutshell, That's why we're here today, to gather input, answer questions from the public. Of course, this video was live streamed. I will conclude my presentation with that. I have our Assistant City Administrator, Dan Allen, here with me. So at this point, we'll take any questions. Well, I'll make up a question then until someone comes up. If you have a question, please come up to the podium. I would think one question that we received from the earlier meeting that we had was about the congestion that may be created from expanding the urban growth boundary, and how would the city responsibly identify ways to reduce that congestion. And my response at that time was the importance of the urban growth boundary is, one, because it allows us to provide additional infrastructure, and part of that infrastructure is road and other ways of connecting, or multimodal connectivity. Right now, the city of Spring Hill, as of late, it was looked at as a bedroom community. And if I'm correct, we have about 92% of the development in Spring Hill is from housing. Housing alone does not provide enough revenue to the city for long-term sustainability in terms of roads, maintenance, etc. So what we're looking to do is expand our office, retail, commercial properties and base, and through that, those additional type of developments, that would allow us to have long-term revenue that we can then project up into 5-10 years, and then we can use those projections and that funding to identify particular roadway projects, or how do we fund additional parks, or how do we fund other things that provide amenities and open space to the city of Spring Hill. So that was one question that we had. Yes, sir. Please come to the podium.
Looking at your northeast area, was there a particular reason that you stopped at your northern line there and didn't travel all the way up to the new roadway that will be the interchange there? Is there a particular reason you didn't go further north? Because it seems like if you're looking for commercial items, that will definitely be a corridor that will be commercially developed.
Yes, there is, as a matter of fact. We're working with other municipalities as well, and Thompson Station is one of the municipalities we're working with. Where we stop at is where Thompson Station's urban growth boundary and property, or their city boundaries, are located. So working with the city of Thompson Station and working with the other municipalities, we identified that was the area that the city of Spring Hill had interest and felt we could grow, expand into responsibly.
Okay.
One other piece on that specific. If you look closely at the map, there's a little bit difference in color on my monitor versus up there, but if you kind of look at that, so we're looking at that yellow expansion area on the east side of 65, right?
Yes.
All right, so if you look closely, you see the purple just north of there where Thompson Station is?
Yes.
All right, in between there's kind of a tan-colored gap, and then you have the proposed UGB.
That's already ours, is it what you're saying?
I believe that is the portion that has already been annexed into the city of Spring Hill to cover the road that's being extended to tie in from the interchange to 431.
Okay. And maybe you could just help me, because I'm not familiar with your color scheme. I noticed that you have the green areas are, and most of that seems to be in Murray County, are WC Spring Hill, I guess, 2021, on your main map there, the green sections, what is that?
Oh, Williamson County, Spring Hill, Urban
Oh.
Growth Boundary 2021.
Well, it's, okay. Is that what that is? Is it WCSH 2021, the green areas, is that?
Oh, the green areas, the Murray County areas that we're,
Yes, yeah.
the Murray County areas are where this.
You're not looking
No,
into.
we're not looking at any expansions in the Murray County area. This is only for the Williamson County area.
Okay. All right.
And just one more note, as you identified in the northeast expansion area, you'll also notice on the top of the land that is already annexed into the city of Spring Hill, there's a subdivision there
Yes.
that is not being considered as part of the urban growth boundary, urban growth boundary. And the reason being is through state law, you would need approximately 66% of every landowner within a particular area in order to sign off on an annexation. And then, of course, this already has infrastructure things as of that, and that would make it very difficult to consider that area. So we didn't include that area in our urban growth boundary.
David.
What can we do about other cities' urban growth that affects our infrastructure? Specifically, the 800 houses off of Greens Mill Road, which are going to come right through because the majority of the people are going to be working north and shopping north. So realizing it's not part of our boundary, but the impact is largely on us.
Well, one great thing about what we're going through, we being the city of Spring Hill and the other 7 municipalities, is as we work together to identify our urban growth boundary areas, it's causing us to become more acquainted to effectively communicate with each other. So if there's something in close proximity, of course, we're going to have that conversation to identify those impacts. Ultimately, an urban growth boundary, once everything is done, what we would like to have, we being all of the municipalities involved in the Williamson County area, is that we can identify particular corridor management agreements or intergovernmental agreements that we can address those concerns as you identified, and will better assist us to not plan in silos, and we can have those conversations on traffic impact, regional impact from developments. So that's one thing that the urban growth boundary expansion should help us with in the future.
Okay, so specifically, what are we doing about 31 and Greens Mill Road as a result of the 800 houses that Columbia is building right on the edge of us? Because it's going to, who knows, quadruple the traffic? I don't know what the estimates are.
That project hasn't come through us, so we haven't really had a chance to review or really see any of the details, like on their traffic study or anything like that. A couple things that we have done though that will help is that we have on both Kedron Road and on Newport Royal Road, we have over the years the city has invested in several conceptual planning exercises and things of that nature. We have conceptual layouts for Kedron Road to be widened to 5 lanes in the future. So any development along Kedron, directly along Kedron, we know what size that facility needs to be. We can assess impact fees and exact right-of-way donations, so we don't have to go back and buy that land later as it develops. The board, mayor, and alderman has also adopted an access management policy in the section of Newport Royal Road from Duplex Road down to Saturn Parkway that gives some restrictions on where new driveway cuts can be and lays out a framework to fix each of those intersections over time as funds come available to go through it. So we try to put things in place so that we can get what we need when somebody comes through, as opposed to just letting somebody do whatever they want and then having to go back and buy something from them later on. That gets very expensive.
Yeah. Well, it just seems, it appears to a bystander or to an untrained eye that a developer who's kind of on the outer limits of, in this case, Columbia, and outside the limits of Spring Hill, but what he brings is a whole lot more infrastructure load onto Spring Hill with nobody's permission, and it's all perfectly legal, with no coordination. And it's going to be a mess. I mean, there's 800 houses is about 2,400 cars, about 5,000 vehicle actions in a day, and no plan for it, no contingency, or no nothing's going to happen.
I think from Spring Hill's perspective, some of the new mixed-use developments that have been approved on the south side of Saturn Parkway, there are some, there's one plan in particular that's got what we call a C-store, a gas station, convenience center, as well as pretty good sized grocery store and some other things along those lines, kind of neighborhood services type things. I think that combined with some long-term widening plans on Port Royal Road will help facilitate some of that additional north-south traffic, because I think, to your point, those people need to go fill up their cars with gas, they're going to go to the grocery, and I expect that site will probably be the closest one to them.
Yeah.
I would expect, some movement north-south on Port Royal, and then probably utilizing the interchange there at Saturn Parkway to either go back over the crossings if they wanted to go to those shops, or commute to work if they wanted to go on up on 65. So we already have those roadway segments identified in our capital improvement program. They're not prioritized for funding at the moment, but that's part of why we have the public engagement. That's why we have these conversations. That's why we update the planning process regularly, because things change and we don't necessarily have control of everything, but we appreciate the feedback because it helps us dial in what we're doing and make adjustments too with our elected officials so that they can be responsive to the needs of the community.
All right, well, thank you for looking into it.
All righty then. Do we have any more questions? Yes, sir.
This time I'd like to just address the western one. What your thoughts were in laying that particular one out, because it appears that that is on the north side, basically bounded into Thompson Station, and even on the east side of it is Thompson Station, and on the south side it looks like it's the county. So that this doesn't look like, unless you're gonna take some other actions later on, it doesn't look like it is tied into any of the current Spring Hill properties. Am I reading that wrong on the map?
Could you place the full map back up, please?
Yeah. So, and maybe I don't understand how the coloring on the maps either, but I'm looking at the tan colors is being representative of those properties that are part of the city of Spring Hill. Is that correct?
Well, the green that you're looking at, that's part of Spring Hill.
Oh, okay. It is. Even though it's part of the county, it's also considered part of Spring Hill then?
Yeah, the green that we're connecting to the northwestern portion of the Williamson County, yeah, that's part of Spring Hill.
Gotcha.
It's part of that Murray County UGB that you were referencing earlier.
Okay.
So basically, we have a UGB that goes out in the green that's not been fully brought into the city yet, kind of like Calvin was describing earlier. We're just looking at layering this piece on the top to kind of fill that little,
Gotcha.
sort of that gap.
Okay. And if nothing else, that would, at least, we would put it on there as, this is what we would like? Because if we don't do that, then Thompson Station could easily take that over as theirs.
Well,
Yeah.
the conversation is, one importance of the urban growth boundary, and I'm using this word rather loosely, it allows the city to have more control of the development that comes into it. If we don't identify our urban growth boundary, which we have already identified in Murray County, if we don't identify it or show interest in that area, that means Thompson Station or the county can, and if they do, that means they will ultimately have the authority to determine what's developed in those areas.
Gotcha. That looks wise. Okay, thanks.
All right, we're great on time here, so if anyone has another question, that would be great. If not, I guess we would conclude this discussion.
Hello. How does this play into the smart growth plan, or kind of what the gentleman there, as far as the traffic and our economic development? How does this play into that?
That's a great question. A couple of ways, as a matter of fact. As I identified earlier, that we have to update our 2040 Rising Plan. So right now, if you're seeing the proposed urban growth boundary areas, they won't be identified in our current 24 Rising Plan. So what we would essentially be doing would be going through the typical planning process, and that is looking at the character of the lands that's surrounding it. What is that character? What is that flavor in that community? And is the development that's being proposed, is it consistent with what's in the area? That is typically how you do a planning process of something that is not captured into your long-range plan. However, as identified, we're looking to update our 2040 Rising Plan. It may be the 2050 Rising Plan, or it may have another title. However, through these conversations and engagement with the community, we will identify what those urban growth boundary areas could be developed as. So when an applicant comes to annex into the city within those urban growth boundaries areas, we would look at our 2050 Rising Plan, and we would identify, after the annexation, what's the appropriate rezoning that has been identified through working with our community, stakeholders, property tax payers, subject matter experts, and department heads and others within the city of Spring Hill. So that's how we would do a responsible growth and development, by utilizing our updated 2050 or whatever the title would be comp plan.
Okay. So you talked a lot about citizens being involved. Like, what's the projected timeline for this, and how can citizens engage with the city about the process?
Well, right now, we're still in an infancy stages with the the update to the urban growth, not urban growth, I'm sorry, the update to the 2050 Rising Plan, or whatever the name would be. So the first steps is we identified the funding. So now we will have to do the request for proposals and qualifications. We're saying that probably going out probably between March to June of 2022.
Okay.
So then you would be looking for about a year from that. So we'll be looking between March of June to 2023 before we have a finalized updated comp plan.
Okay.
So, however, the comp plan looks for development in 10-year increments. The urban growth boundary looks for development in the 10 to 20 years. So our comp plan would identify the next 10 years of growth. However, the information that we're gaining from these conversations now will be used to feed into the updating of our comp plan and determining on how we would look 10 to 20 years in the future for those urban growth boundary areas.
Okay. And what communities are we in collaboration with these conversations? You quoted quite a few communities.
The ones that will impact us here would be Thompson Station and Williamson County. However, as part of the overall conversation for urban growth boundary in Williamson County, that's about 7 cities or counties. So of course, Williamson County, Nolensville, Fairview, Brent, Franklin, City of Spring Hill. So we have all of those other cities that are inside of Williamson County.
Okay. So it's 2 conversations, it's Spring Hill itself and then Williamson County itself.
It's more than 2, but yes, essentially what you're saying.
Well, yeah, that's
yes.
what I'm saying. It's Williamson County and all those cities
correct.
within Williamson County, and then Spring Hill specifically.
That's correct.
So one of the things you mentioned was about parks, and so we had a task force for parks, and of course we have no parks here. We have no space, we have no green space, we have no fields, we're very little, very limited with use for our children. I think the projection that was put forth by the task force, my children are already aged out to some degree, but you know, little kids like my neighbors, they still wouldn't be able to take advantage of anything that was new. How is that incorporated into this plan, or is it?
Well, it should be, and it will be, as you identified. One of the more difficult things to do when we're looking for open space, parks, amenities that are public is infill development. That means essentially reusing existing land that has already been developed, and that's infill development. They're difficult because if you're within the city, if the land already has the necessary infrastructure, you're in particular areas, the cost of that land is going to be expensive. So to use a piece of land that is already expensive to develop and then someone to dedicate it as a park that brings no revenue, that's a really difficult thing to do. So when you're looking at urban growth boundary expansions, you're looking at undeveloped green lands. So they are more realistic, that you can plan for in the future to incorporate as open space, parks, and things as of that. However, with infill development, a tool that we can use is as developers look to have a little more latitude or creativity with infill development, they're willing to provide additional public benefits to the city. And those public benefits do come into the look of open space, amenities, parks, etc. So one thing that we're looking at is not only getting open space, but we're looking to acquiring usable open space that aren't necessarily in floodplains, but land that we can use as parks and that the city can maintain and that others can actually utilize it. So those are things that we're looking at. However, in order to utilize them in infill developments, the city has to be a little more creative as we work with developers.
Okay, so let me see if I can understand this as a citizen, just for purposes of, you know, developers that are wanting to come and put forth their plans. So as a citizen, as plans, developers come into Spring Hill and they want to develop their communities. So it's our job to advocate here, and I'm asking the question, for those developers to have, I guess, an addendum to their, development for parks? I mean, how do we, as a citizen, say, okay, you can put these extra homes here, that's gonna clog up our traffic and do all these things, but, if you can also add, some green space for parks, that would, sweeten the pot. How do I, as a citizen, help and advocate for that? Or can I?
Yes, you can. Actually, like what you're doing today, that's one step. The second step is through the planning process, we have our planning commission. And the planning commission has a work session and a voting meeting. And then the same for our board of mayor and aldermen. So it's during the planning commission, if a development is identified, citizens can come out, they can speak on those during the work session, they can send the planning department emails, identifying things that they would like, and we can have that conversation with the developer. Typically, that comes into a couple of options. If a developer is looking to do a by right development, and that is essentially they're going into a zoning that whatever they're requesting is allowed, and it's just simply, if it's allowed by right, the city is looking just to make certain they're meeting the facade, they're meeting the infrastructure, but it's little that the city can do on that one. However, when you have the more creative developments, like the mixed-use developments or planned developments, or they're going to a particular district that calls out, a particular amount of open space in terms of amenities or public benefits, that's when we get creative, if we can have those conversations. The citizens can come out as we're doing today, and you can verbalize, I want to see more open space. I want to see more passive, active open space. And then the planning commission would take that in consideration as they're making their decision, as long as with staff, to see if there's opportunities to include that park or other types of open space in those developments.
Okay. Last question. I know that there is a rule or a request or something that, Dan, that you proposed about sewer and flooding and water and things like that prior to the development getting down the path, right? How does that come into play, and is that traffic part? Is there a traffic study going to be kind of incorporated into this urban growth, kind of as that gentleman said, because it's going to be horrible? Is there any prerequisite due diligence by the city to kind of admonish the developer to bring smart or more efficient planning to the table? I know that's not, I don't think that rule or whatever that is you proposed about putting things in the front end, the beginning of the process instead of the end of the process. I don't think that's completely approved yet, but I'm just kind of asking if those things are going to kind of come in tandem so that we can at least have something in play for expecting developers to do their due diligence, so we don't have flooding, and more flooding than we already have, when they provide their plans to the city.
Yes, on multiple fronts. So the the ordinance changes related to the water and sewer capacity studies has now passed through the Planning Commission with a favorable recommendation. It had its first reading, the first portion of it had its first reading this past Monday night. There's a second component related to Title 18 that's going to trail behind. We expect most of that to be done and have been voted on by the end of the year. And then the implementation date, I believe, will be early next year, if I remember correctly. Okay. What that will do is once that is in place, even on an annexation, there will have to be a discussion about water demand and sewer capacity and what expectations are, and putting some early numbers together and having that modeled in our overall water and sewer model. That is a critical component of smart growth because we have a model. Anything that comes on, it's pretty easy to run a quick scenario. Hey, if you want to do 100 houses, We know generally what the flow should be on that. We plug it in, we see, hey, on that line with everything else that's tied to that main interceptor, you know, is that going to push us over a threshold where a line needs to be upsized, or is it going to create an overflow event, or any other variety of things? We're going to be able to trigger that early on. The other thing that's important about the capacity studies is every time they come back to the city. So I want to do an annexation. All right, you're doing a capacity study. I want to do rezoning. Hey, we're going to revisit this again if something changes, because it often does. Because as you get further along the process, it starts to dial in and get more refined. Every time they come back to us, every step along the way, we reassess, and the developer's paying for that. But we have control as a city over the model, and we're maintaining the model. So it's not, hey, you know, developer and your consultants, go do your own study and present your results to us. We've got the master model and all of the data, and we're maintaining that and keeping that in the appropriate condition to take care of everything, and then adding their data onto that. That's going to be a critical component to managing our growth going forward. So early next year, that should be, pending BOMA action, should hopefully be fully implemented. In terms of, you know, adding service and things like that, it's really important in this conversation, and I really am thankful that all the cities in Williamson County are working together and having this discussion and going through this process, because if you're going to talk about smart growth, you need to have a smart discussion about setting the edge. What is the ultimate boundary of Spring Hill? What is the ultimate boundary of Nolensville? Every city needs to be able to answer that question and have confidence in where that line, or set that edge, where that edge is going to be, because that becomes then the edge that we can plan to. And so I would expect, if this is implemented, there's likely going to be some follow-up work through planning and engineering on Spring Hill's side to update a variety of capacity studies and things like that, to really look at what's the real expectation of what it's going to take to serve these areas, and, you know, what's the best location for some of these interceptors, you know, on the east side and up and all that, to really set all that. Because then, as these property owners over time start to have discussions or get approached, when they start coming in and talking to the city, we have confidence that we know what the edge is that we're planning to. We can put the tools in place to say, all right, a full build out of that UGB, which might be 40 years down the line, you know, I might have to have, you know, a 42-inch sewer interceptor that runs all the way up, you know, from 65 all the way out to the edge along a creek. We may not necessarily build all of that up front. You know, it may need to come in the form of a parallel pipe. It may be, you know, two 18 inches next to each other. You do the first one now, and as things come on, they contribute fees, and we make them set aside easements and build for it. But if we know we have to add a second one later, maybe instead of getting the standard 20-foot easement, maybe we get 40 or 50 feet to leave room for all of that. So it puts us in position, so when Calvin and his team are reviewing things on the planning side, they have the technical backing to be able to go through the exaction process to get the things that we need donated up front, so that we don't have to come back and basically have costly acquisitions on the back end to make room for things. On the utility side, that's the biggest benefit I see from it. And I think, you know, I think that spills over just as well, same concepts, into road planning and traffic studies. We have had some discussions, it's not gone before the BOMA yet, about potentially applying that same concept on the water and sewer modeling to traffic studies as well. Let the city hold and maintain a master traffic model that not only, you know, isn't just for the planning department's benefit on reviewing development, it also helps us on the capital improvement side and coordinating with TDOT, as well as you know, the MPO, road planning, road funding, all that kind of stuff. We keep our model in tune with what they're doing and keep it up to date. we get a lot of benefit. Those are the kind of smart growth, nuts and bolts kind of things that if you put those in place and we're disciplined about maintaining those models and keeping that process and having the applicants who are creating the impacts make the appropriate payments to fund that work as it goes along, that really puts us in position to start utilizing all of these other documents that we've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in over the last few years. You know, we have a new comp plan. We're going to update it again. We've got, you know, modernized zoning and subdivision regulations. You start pulling all these pieces together and it becomes a cohesive process where you don't get a bedroom community. And we're starting to see that now. We're getting new development proposals that are a mixture of uses. And when you look at their traffic studies, you know, they have this process called bypass trips, where, you know, if I live in an apartment in a mixed-use community and there's a grocery store there and there's a gas station there and there's, you know, a retail strip that has services as well as restaurants, I may not leave that mixed-use development every time I need to go someplace. I may just pop around the corner. I might even walk, depending on how it's designed. And so those new rules and regulations, they've only been in effect for a little over 3 years. So we're just starting to now see kind of the transition from the old zoning rules, which have been amended over the years, but really, you know, we're from a time when we had less than 1,000 people and it was a predominantly rural agricultural community. We're a city of 50,000 now. It's very different. And so these new tools that have been put in place have taken that into account or looking ahead. And so we're going to start to see more and more of these kinds of things. The area close to 65 is of particular importance because you heard Calvin talk earlier about you know, this perception of Spring Hill as a bedroom community. A lot of projects have come through that are just now getting ready to start construction that over the next 5 years are really going to start to shake up that perception and change it. Keep in mind we're investing nearly $100 million into road projects around the I-65 Buckner interchange and everything that goes with that. We have one large development on the Alexander Farm called Jude Lake that has a lot of these non-residential components that are really, really important to help us build our tax base. That's only on one side of 65, right? So if you're going to spend $100 million, you'd like to maximize your return on it, right? So you start looking at this urban growth boundary, our comprehensive plans, our major thoroughfare plans. We've already looked at planning out into this area. You know, that area along 65 is a tremendous opportunity for the city of Spring Hill to have more non-residential type development. That helps build the tax base. And I'm going to come all the way back to where you started when you talk about parks. Building the non-residential tax base for Spring Hill in these strategic areas where it makes sense is a game changer for us over the long haul, because that builds that property tax base, it builds the retail sales taxes and all these other things that we've been lacking over the years because, you know, we're over 90% residential. We're going to start to see that percentage shift over the next couple decades. And that's going to increase the revenue coming to the city, and it's going to open up opportunities to correct some of these deficiencies that we've had related to open space and parks and sidewalks and amenities and a lot of things that we want. It's also going to create opportunities for recruitment of more things that people in our community want, so they don't have to drive, you know, north or south to get those things up. So I know that was a lot, but there's, for a little shape that's yellow, there's a lot of thought that's going into it, looking out, you know, 20 to 40 years, depending on what scenario. So I hope that helps explain it.
No, it definitely does. I lied. I have one more question. So this is Williamson County focused, right? And we are partially Murray County here, and Murray County's, you know, busting out the seams here up the street. How do we, or is this plan available to absorb the impact of our neighboring county that is doing expanding their boundaries and expanding their development much more quicker than we are. How are we able to absorb some of that impact? Because some of the traffic, okay, we're talking about is not here. It's down there, right? I mean, so it's coming, it's flooding into our areas, and so some of that challenge, we have to be able to look at the neighboring counties that's not in Williamson County, and how we, plan smartly to absorb some of that impact. How does that, or does that even apply with that question? Do you understand what I'm asking?
I think I do. Just for clarity, are you asking that the developments that are occurring in Williamson County,
County.
and Murray County, how do we plan for that development in Spring Hill, the traffic from that? Is that what you're asking?
I'm really talking more so about the Murray County, like what's right at our border here. So it's how are we able to absorb the impact of that smartly so it doesn't, flood over and cause us problems? I guess that's what I'm saying. I mean, how does that considered?
Well, I would say the short answer would be if we're talking about traffic, when we look at our traffic impact studies. The traffic impact studies look at particular intersections, they look at particular developments, and the average daily counts of traffic, we call them trip generations, as they go through a particular area. So if it's a development in Murray County, and we'll just say it's along 31, even though the city of Spring Hill may not have a say in the planning that they're doing. However, if a development comes into Spring Hill along that area and we're required to have a traffic impact study, it's going to capture those vehicle trips as it goes past a particular intersection or a particular area. So if you're asking from that standpoint, the traffic impact study will show the type of roadway improvements that are required for that development. So
Yeah, I think that you get me, but one, I guess, go back to Dan. So the traffic modeling we don't have up front, right? It's not up front in our process. It's more like the sewer and water are being corrected now to be up front. How do we get the traffic modeling in a consideration up front with the planning?
Well,
instead of behind, or at least it feels like we have reactive traffic modeling instead of proactive. So that's kind of what I'm asking about, because Murray County is always gonna, regardless if we talk to them or not, and they're not in this proposal, but they're still gonna impact us because they're right here. They're not gonna really impact Nolensville and Fairview. They're really gonna impact us.
yeah, with traffic studies, or we're talking about traffic, and I would just want to piggyback off something that Dan just said earlier. A lot of our developments occurred prior to the Unified Development Code. So those traffic studies that were done, or those developments at that time, did not take in consideration the newer developments. However, the newer developments took into consideration the older developments. So the more developments that come out, the Unified Development Codes calls out specifically when a traffic study must be had. For instance, if we have a restaurant with a drive-through, they have to do a traffic study. If we have a housing community that has over 100 single-family houses, they have to have a traffic study. If we have a multifamily with over a townhome with over 187 units, they have to have a traffic study. Or developments that the planning director or city identifies should have a traffic study, has to have a traffic study. So when we look at new development, now if you're looking at an existing plan development where the traffic generated should have already been taken into consideration, a business leaving out, a new one coming in, that wouldn't warrant a traffic study.
That's a net, yeah.
Yes, but if we're talking about new development, new plan developments, that's when they'll be doing new traffic studies. Or if just say a development came through 2 years ago, they received all of their rights to have that development, but they didn't develop it in 2 years. They come back, but they did a traffic study at that time. 2 years later, they come back, okay, I'm ready to do this development. The traffic study is over a year old. So then we'll say, you need to update your traffic study.
Okay.
I think another piece of that too is, so when we did our water and sewer capacity analysis, you know, it extended out and did some projections out into some of the urban growth boundaries, a little bit more so on the Murray County side because it was a little more defined at the time. But basically what our consultants did on that is they looked at the 2040 Spring Hill Rising Plan and the projected future land uses. And there's, you know, some guidance in those broad use classifications in terms of like density and what types of development, things like that could go in there. So they used some industry standard projections for raw land. So something might have been on the Murray County side, for instance, and maybe it was 100 acres and it was agricultural right now, today's zoning. But on our future, you know, land use plan and the 2040 Spring Hill Rising Plan, maybe 50 acres was identified as maybe like gateway area, which is more intense, you know, that's intended to be like office buildings and higher intensity type things. But the backside of it might have been like medium residential. Well, what the consultants did on that is they assigned some placeholder densities to just try to get in the ballpark based on the different land uses, and that was used to generate future flows in the water sewer capacity. You could easily take the same concept and apply that, you know, if just because there's not something on it yet, if we know per the comp plan, it's meant to be, say, rural residential, and the intent is to have a density no more than like 1 unit per 2 acres, well, there you go. We just figured it out, right? So we could put a quick little factor in there for open space, take off, you know, 20% for that, and then whatever's left over, you kind of figure out what the impact is, and then have some trip generation created off of that. Here's the fun part about that. If we incorporate that philosophy into our overall model, then the benefit of it is if somebody comes in and says, okay, I've identified this piece here that I want to do something with, and I have decided that I want to do, I'll just use something ridiculous to make the point. I want to do 30 units an acre, like just extreme, you know, like high density, high rise apartments. But it's identified in the comp plan as a rural residential usage. Well, they would have to do a comp plan change, and that would trigger some discussions about, well, wait a minute, what have we planned for on this? Based on the comp plan, we have some initial projections that are this impact, and what you're asking to do is now this impact, and that creates all of these issues on traffic and water and sewer. And so you see it truly becomes a smart growth management tool, because you're not just, you know, it puts our appointed and elected officials in position to make data-driven decisions, and they're not just, you know, reacting to a request or somebody, you know, that they know, or they're lobbying particular hard or anything like that. It creates a level of objectivity, and that's our job as staff, right? We give them the facts and the data and do the best we can to put them in position to make the best positions possible.
Okay. That's all I got, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, this concludes our discussion. Thanks everyone who tuned in or who's watching it after the fact.